Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening to those of our friends in Europe. I'm Viola Ganger, the senior Washington editor of Just Security and a research scholar at NYU School of Law. On behalf of the NYU Law Forum series sponsored by Latham and Watkins, the Reese Center on Law and Security and Just Security, I'd like to welcome you to this discussion on the Russia-Ukraine crisis, navigating law, diplomacy, and force. Today at 5:45 a.m. Ukraine time, 9:45 p.m. last night, US Eastern time, Russian President Vladimir Putin declared war against Ukraine, announcing a special military operation, as he put it, using the standard Kremlin disinformation points to smear Ukraine. He referred to a goal of demilitarizing, denazifying Ukraine. Explosions began to be heard immediately in major cities such as Kharkiv in the east, Mariupol in the south, both of which have long been considered major targets for Russia, but also in the port of Odessa, in the capital Kiev, and elsewhere. Putin has, by some estimates, at least 770,000 troops arrayed around three sides of Ukraine, as well as tanks, heavy artillery, and extensive air and naval assets. This attack came after weeks of warnings from the Biden administration and NATO that Putin was on track to wage such an attack. And of course, Putin began mobilizing troops near Ukraine's border even a year ago, soon after President Biden took office, up to 100,000 at the time. He backed off when Biden scheduled a summit with him in June, but only withdrew a few thousand of those forces. He began ramping up again in late October, early November this time, against the backdrop of a lengthy written diatribe that the Kremlin had published by Putin. Last August, he reiterated his belief in that diatribe that Ukraine is not an independent nation. In December, Russia issued written demands that the US and NATO agree to a treaty that would halt any expansion of the alliance. This time, the military escalation continued and expanded to the Black Sea in the south and to Belarus in the north, so that Ukraine was bracketed on three sides in a buildup unprecedented since World War II. NATO allies also have outed a number of alleged Russian plans to destabilize Ukraine and or create false flag operations that might have provided cover for a new invasion. In the end, he didn't need any of those. He just plowed ahead. President Biden is scheduled to speak today at 12:30, possibly announcing further sanctions beyond those imposed in recent days. So where do we go from here? We have an amazing panel of experts to discuss the latest developments, the history behind it, and where we do go from here. Dan Baer is acting director of the Europe program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's former US ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the Department of State. Tess Bridgman, Senior Fellow and Visiting Scholar at the Reese Center on Law and Security, co-editor-in-chief of Just Security, and a former Deputy Legal Advisor for the National Security Council, Special Assistant to the President, and Associate Counsel to the President. Daniel Fried is Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council. He's former Coordinator for Sanctions Policy, Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, and US Ambassador to Poland, US at the Department of State. Rose Gottemüller is the Stephen Hasey Lecturer at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. She's a former Deputy Secretary General of NATO and Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security at the Department of State. Thank you all for joining us. We have as I said, an amazing panel with deep expertise on all of these issues. So we'll get right into it. We also have questions that we received from the audience, and I would encourage any members of the audience who still want to add questions to put those into the Q&A function. I'm going to start with Dan Fried on sanctions. which is top of mind for everyone as a key tool in the West's response to Putin. The Biden administration began mobilizing allies in NATO and European Union immediately last fall when it became clear that Putin was ramping up again. Created diplomatic responses, worked with Congress and allies on potential sanctions that would be imposed in the event of an invasion, and offering steps to try to assuage Russian concerns about the proximity of NATO forces. None of those initiatives have deterred Putin. So Dan Fried, which sanctions do you think now provide the biggest hammers, potentially, against Russia? Does it still make sense to hold any in reserve versus levying them all right now and trying to maintain them? What discussions do you think are going on at the moment?
The Biden administration has long planned and now assembled a set of sanctions, and I think the president's going to announce them in about an hour. The biggest stick is going to be the financial sanctions, and we got a taste of that day before yesterday when the president announced we were imposing full blocking sanctions against two major Russian state banks, the number 5 and the number 8 bank, in terms of capitalization. I think we'll hear more of that today. I think we're going to go after some of the biggest Russian state banks. VTB and Sberbank, I expect to be on the list, and I hope the administration opts to continue full blocking sanctions as opposed to something less. We need to hit them hard. In addition, it's not a sanction, but I suspect we're going to move forward with this major export control, this restriction on the export of semiconductors made anywhere in the world with American technology or input. That's the use of the foreign direct products rule, a wonky term, which means if it's got American content, you can't ship it. It is subject to restrictions. That's a big sanction, and I think we've got the Asian allies signed up, at least the Japanese, Singapore, Taiwan is what I've heard. I don't think South Korea will buck us. There's a question of China, but I think the administration has planned this. That's a big set of sanctions. To answer your question, what's left on the table? Well, SWIFT is taken on a kind of mythical importance as the mother of all sanctions, and it really isn't. Okay, it's too easy to make a substitute for SWIFT. It's a messaging service, so you use something that's less efficient. It's not as big a deal as people say. But if you want, I think the question is always, and Daniel Baer and Rose Gottemiller know this really well from government, you always want to ask yourself, what's next? And the what's next could be moving on Russia's central bank. That's huge. Treasury hates sanctioning central banks. And there's a question of financial blowback. But that's the next step. I think the Biden administration is going to hit the Russian economy hard. I think they're right to do so. I think they will have done so after proper coordination with the allies. Good for them. The bad news is it often takes more time for sanctions to work than you wish it would. But that's another story. That's not your question. So thanks, Viola, for doing this. Wish it were under better circumstances.
As do we all, I'm sure, Dan. Thank you very much. I want to get back at some point about what you think, how you think Putin has prepared for that possibility of very severe sanctions, but we'll get to that again later on. Rose, I wanted to come to you next and get your thoughts on how you assess NATO's handling of this crisis, and how does it compare in your experience to others that the alliance has faced in the past? What have been some of the key obstacles to unity and effectiveness, for example? How to keep the how do you think it would be possible to maintain transatlantic unity going forward, especially within the alliance, but also with other allies such as Japan and so forth?
Viola, Putin has done NATO a great favor by taking these actions. I was just reading the NATO website this morning. There's been a North Atlantic Council meeting in emergency session. NATO was quick off the mark with condemnation of the attack, the horrifying attack, as the alliance put it, on Ukraine. So really, always NATO was subject to attempts by Russia to divide the alliance. And always there were concerns about wedge driving by the Russians between and among various allies. And we have seen it in recent years between the so-called, old Europe and new Europe. Not that the countries of the former Warsaw Pact haven't been European all along, but they've taken on that moniker. And there was a lot of wedge driving going on when I was Deputy Secretary General of NATO by the Russian Federation to try to drive wedges between the Germanys and the Frances and those former Warsaw Pact countries who are the newer members of NATO. Not now, not now. It has really, the actions of Putin over the last months and the Russian Federation have really driven the NATO alliance to a point of unity that I have never seen before. And I believe will continue in terms of unified resolve to deter and defend the alliance and to do everything they can at this juncture to prevent any spillover from the conflict in Ukraine from affecting NATO territory. And that's going to be a difficult job to do. They will also have to respond to, I am sure, an uptick in continuing cyber attacks and other kinds of hybrid actions in that gray zone between crisis and well, we used to say peace, but I'm not sure where we are in Europe at the moment. We are in a grave crisis at the moment. But long story short, I do believe NATO is unified as never before, and I believe they will stay unified now, and we will see what the next steps are. I'm very interested in what the president has to say about cooperation with allies, but I agree with Dan Fried that I think there will be a lot of cooperation on the economic front as well in terms of sanctions.
Thank you very much for that, Rose. Dan Baer, I want to turn to you next. Give us your take on why this conflict matters to the United States and to Americans, not only for how it fits into the larger geopolitical issues, but also what the potential impact of this crisis is or might be down the road on the average American. Does the effect go beyond the potential increase in energy prices, which is what we hear about so often? And how well do you think the administration, the Biden administration, has communicated the significance of this conflict?
Thanks very much. Obviously, this is an incredibly sad day. And I think the feeling that history is unfolding around us, and I think it's probably not an exaggeration to say that we are living through the most consequential week in European security since maybe the fall of the Berlin Wall and maybe before. And unfortunately, this is a giant step backward. I actually think it's much easier to say why this matters to the average American today than it was yesterday, because I think for as long as so-called frozen conflicts or isolated conflicts remain relatively isolated in faraway places, it's harder to explain, even though they do impact American interests, it's harder to explain to the average American. But this is a major war in the middle of Europe. And the United States and its citizens have a stake in there being a functioning global system. We have a stake in it for things like pandemic response. We have a stake in it for shipping lanes. We have a stake in it for global trade. We have a stake in it for food prices. We have a stake in it for natural resources on which our homes are heated and our factories run. And we have worked very hard with partners and allies over the last 3 generations to build functioning rules that can prevent massive disruptions to the international system. And a war like this is a massive disruption. And I think what's particularly tragic about this particular moment is that the speech that Vladimir Putin gave on Monday night was not the speech of somebody who's trying to momentarily suspend the rules in order to reorient certain realities on the ground. It was an outright rejection of the basis for those rules. It was a rewriting not only of history, but of what kind of international system we should have. And that's incredibly dangerous, and I think a long-term challenge for us to face. But for the average American, we're going to see the ripple effects of this crisis, not only in that it will make us less safe. We could see cyber attacks that, we've seen cyber attacks in the last 12 months that have shut down oil pipelines, that have shut down meatpacking plants, that have caused gas shortages at gas stations, that have caused food prices to go up. So we could see ripple effects in the near term in terms of that. We could see ripple effects, as the president has made clear, in terms of energy prices. But the big ripple effect is the fact that this makes the world less prosperous and less safe. And that means that more American resources there will be fewer resources to go around, and more American resources will be needed to protect the American people. I guess the last thing that I would say, and I think that there's conventional wisdom in Washington that the American people, the American voters, don't really care about foreign policy. And certainly there is a strong force on both the far left and the far right in our country right now that is crudely isolationist. But I think most Americans hold pretty tight to the universal values on which our country was founded. And when you have a country of 40 million people who have expressed in demonstrable ways time and time again that they have no desire to live under an authoritarian government, that they want to be part of a free and democratic country that is part of a free and democratic family of countries, if they are making that call and we don't have a response to that, then we aren't who we think we are. And I think that holds for America, for Europeans, and for democratic people living in democratic systems around the world, that part of what matters is the principles at stake, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. And I think it's incredibly sad to watch a country of 40 million that has already struggled once in this generation be forced to deal with an aggressive war a second time in one generation.
Thank you. Very, very well articulated. And thank you. Tess Bridgman, I want to turn to you next. Former UN Special Rapporteur David Kaye tweeted last night as this wider war got underway that quote, wars of aggression are crimes under international law for which individuals should be held criminally liable. He said Putin very clearly fits the bill. It's a criminal act, quote unquote. What can you tell us about that? And what are the other most crucial and relevant elements of international law you think are immediately relevant here?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. We all want to see accountability in these circumstances for all of the reasons that Dan Baer just laid out. I think there will be a lot of thorny legal issues as this conflict plays out. Unfortunately, the biggest one is incredibly clear-cut. As David Kaye said, this is a very textbook case of aggression. It's a brazen violation of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, violating Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. I should note, of course, Russia already did that dating back to 2014, but this is a clear, full escalation of that in a way that has no pretext and is clearly unprovoked. The bedrock principles of the international legal order here are what Putin is challenging. It's also important to note here that Putin's attempt to muddy the waters as to whether there was a legal pretext for his actions failed completely. His purported rationales were simply based on too many blatant falsehoods to hold any water. And the work of the US intelligence community and its partners was really important in staying one step ahead of Putin's narrative and exposing the falsehoods, preventing him from being able to shift momentum towards the narrative he was trying to build. So by preempting any pretext for the invasion, the absence of a provocation for Russia's aggression is very clear here. So the case could not be more clear cut. Ambassador Kaye looked at Article 8 of the Rome Statute. I won't read it out for you today, but yes, these are clear-cut acts that would clearly meet the elements of aggression. But can we turn to the ICC to prosecute them, and what forms of accountability are available? That's a much more difficult question. The ICC's jurisdiction over the crime of aggression is very narrow. So for that crime and that crime only, the ICC only has jurisdiction, and that's the International Criminal Court, only has jurisdiction when both the territorial victim state, Ukraine here, and the aggressor state, Russia, are state parties to the Rome Statute, which is not the case here. Unless the Security Council were to refer Russia, which obviously won't happen so long as Russia has the veto. So turning to the ICC to actually prosecute aggression per se is just not going to be an option here. There are, though, and there likely will be, there have already been, and there unfortunately likely will be more war crimes and crimes against humanity that are committed in the context of this armed conflict. And the ICC does have jurisdiction over those. Ukraine has submitted what are called 12-3 declarations, essentially giving the ICC jurisdiction over certain acts or for certain periods of time. And it has expanded that voluntary consent to jurisdiction over time to now include basically anything after 2014. Whether acts committed in Ukraine can then be tied all the way up to Putin and how far up the chain of command they can be traced, that's a more difficult issue. The ICC so far has tried in at least a couple of cases to tie the acts of foot soldiers up to their leaders and has not typically been successful. And I think, we have reason to believe that it might be very difficult to actually see, a Putin or any of his, closest cronies actually taking the stand. I think all of that said, it's important to note that there are other forms of accountability. The grave breaches regime in the Geneva Conventions that kicks in international armed conflicts is important here. So all states should already be on notice. All states that are parties to the Geneva Conventions, which is almost all of them, are on alert to repress Russian actions like assassinations of dissidents in foreign countries. We could see, any number of actions that states would be able to prosecute. The Geneva Conventions require states to criminalize grave breaches like torture, unlawful extrajudicial killings, et cetera, and to search for and prosecute those responsible. So at a very minimum, you should see those responsible for these crimes not ever able to travel again, but there, could be hope that you could have prosecutions, in foreign capitals in the future. And the very last point here is that there are other forms of accountability aside from criminal accountability that, at least in the short term, but potentially over the medium and long terms as well, will be just as important, if not more. The sanctions that Dan Fried was just describing that can be ratcheted up significantly, but also things like kicking Russia out of certain international organizations, suspending its privileges, visa bans so that the cronies can't travel and can't live the lives they're accustomed to, getting more serious about shutting down and countering, if that's not completely possible, Russia's international propaganda machine. All of these kinds of acts are also forms of accountability, and getting really serious about those other measures while at the same time thinking through ways that prosecutions might develop over time. I think those are going to be really important in the short term.
Thank you very much, Tess. That's very helpful. Really, really great sort of overview there. I want to throw a question out, and I'd be interested to hear what several of you think about this one. This is, of course, not the start of the Russian-instigated conflict in Ukraine, which already before yesterday had killed more than 14,000 people since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014, when it annexed Crimea and supported an insurgency in the east. That Russian offensive captured Crimea, as I mentioned, and the conflict in eastern Ukraine that has played out has been like trench warfare that harkens back to World War I era or something. Some of those pictures that we see from this conflict and from that historic conflict. This assault that started overnight, last night, is massive. Several in our audience have asked, what are the risks of spillover into NATO's eastern flank, even if inadvertent? Or as someone in the audience asked, risks of second or third order effects on those NATO countries. And I'd be very interested in hearing from any of you on that.
Well, why don't I start? Because I know that NATO has been thinking very hard about spillover effects. I think the spillover possibilities are quite real already at this point. In the recent years, as tensions have built up, there have been a number of air incursions, certainly incursions at sea, and close and really unsafe operations at sea and in the air of Russian aircraft, Russian naval ships, et cetera. So I think that NATO has to expect that that kind of activity is going to continue. I know that NATO will do everything it can to prevent incursions from turning into escalation. It has been, I will say, practicing quite a bit the air policing operations in both the Baltic states and in southeast Europe, Romania, Bulgaria area have been extensive in recent years. And so NATO has had a lot of practice, and that means, air forces from across NATO send aircraft to partake of the air policing mission. So I think NATO has a lot of practice. They're accustomed to dealing with this. This is now bumped up to a new level where we actually are in a state of conflict between Ukraine and Russia. So, it's much more dangerous, of course, but I did want to convey that this is not, in some ways, a brand new threat to NATO. They have been confronting it in recent years and actually talking to the Russians a lot about how do we get to a point where we can avoid these incidents and avoid accidents occurring of this kind that could lead to escalation. What I wanted to mention at this juncture, and I know we'll talk about it some more, is the fact that everything that was on the list of Russian demands that the United States and NATO thought worthwhile doing, of course, we could not respond to the really egregious Russian demands such that Ukraine could never become a member of NATO, or that NATO would draw back to its 1997 level, its borders. Those kinds of things, of course, we could not respond to, but there was a whole list of things on that list that NATO was willing to talk about. And I do not see a future here for any of that diplomacy. And I think that too, we're so concerned about the armed conflict today that we must focus on that first and foremost. But the notion that we could put in place through diplomacy some measures to improve confidence, mutual confidence, and predictability, that's off the table now for the foreseeable future. And I do think that is a tragedy as well. We were right on the cusp, I think, of making some improvements in the European security architecture. It would have been difficult because Russia is so obstreperous and so uncooperative right now, but nevertheless, I think we could have made some improvements, but we're going rapidly in the opposite direction. And at the moment, I see no hope for diplomacy resuming and making any progress for the foreseeable future.
Can I come in?
Yes, please.
Because Rose is profoundly right. And I want to double down on that. We're naturally consumed with short run implications and how the war is going to unfold. I get that. That's the right focus. The strategic shift, and she's put her finger right on it, is what are the longer term implications? Every US administration from George H.W. Bush has reached out to the Kremlin. All of them had reasons for doing so. All of them enjoyed some success. All of them were ultimately frustrated. There's no going back to reset 2.0 or stable and predictable or anything like that. Putin is a hostile actor. He is a 20th century tyrant, aggressive at home and aggressive abroad. Okay, let's be clear. And Rose has been one of the champions of stabilizing relations with Moscow, building on common interests. And she's really, really good at it. That's not where we're going to be. It's going to be principally an adversarial relationship with a hostile power. And by the way, if you've watched Putin's interaction with his national security team, he's into Stalinist territory. Like this is, kind of World War II level stuff, down to the lists of Ukrainians that he'll send to concentration camps or shoot. Okay? The United States and Europe need to think through the longer term strategic implications. Where are we with Russia? Now, the Biden administration didn't want to focus on Russia. They wanted to focus on China. I totally get that. That's a rational call. It doesn't matter what they wanted. We didn't want to deal with two authoritarians at the same time. That's nice. We have to. We have to draw those conclusions. We need to work with Europe, with the Asian democracies, with India. We need to take this seriously. And I don't sense any reaction. I don't know about you, Dan and Rose, Tess, my contacts with people in the administration is that they're seriously pissed off. They tried stable and predictable. They took hits for doing so. And now they've got something that is close to Hitler's attack on Poland in September 1939.
Yeah, exactly. If I could just take the floor briefly once again. Thank you, Dan, for the foot stomp. You said it better than I could, but I did want to remark on one of the Russian commentators who said this morning that Putin has abandoned the strategic objectives of Russia to play in the world in a certain way, advancing certain, again, mutual goals, abandoned Russia's strategic objectives in favor of his idée fixe, that he has to grab and hold Ukraine and turn it into part of a community with Belarus, go back, back to the future, so to say. So that really struck me this morning. And I'm wondering if, we're looking upon Russia heading toward being a kind of DPRK, but a very large pariah state. And in that case, I think we really have to think hard about what our stance is going to be.
Thank you, Rose. Dan Baer or Tess Bridgman, did either one of you want to weigh in on that, the potential for spillover into the eastern flank at the moment? And I have sort of a follow-up to that for Dan Baer anyway. So if you'd like to go ahead, Dan, go ahead.
Do you want to ask your follow-up first and I'll pick up the spillover in my answer?
Yeah, sure. How do the democratic and authoritarian leanings of leaders in that eastern region of NATO, the Baltics, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, et cetera, affect the response of NATO and the West generally to this crisis?
Great. So two distinct questions there. In terms of the spillover first, I agree very much with Rose and Dan that at the strategic level we're in a whole new ballgame. At the tactical level, I actually think there may be, it's hard to contemplate what could happen in the coming weeks and months without feeling sick to your stomach. But if what people think is going to happen, and there's a significant military defeat of Ukraine and some form of Russian occupation, that does put Russian troops much closer, a large number of Russian troops prospectively much closer to NATO. And it does raise the prospects of, and the aside of unintentional, that's not an aside, it raises the prospects of an unintentional interaction. And we do need to take steps to mitigate those risks. We did take steps like that in the 1970s, and we took them more recently with respect to Syria about 5 years ago or 7 years ago to negotiate protocols to try to remove the possibility of unintended interactions in the air, et cetera. And I think there will be a need for diplomacy on the kind of nuts and bolts level that is in the interest of both sides. And I think the Russians actually will be interested in that too. So I think that is a real risk that we're going to see more of in the coming weeks, months, and there will need to be some diplomacy. It won't be grand diplomacy. It'll be just trying to make sure the worst doesn't happen. In terms of what this means with respect to NATO and the struggles that NATO has had in recent years with respect to the democratic the recession of democracy within NATO. I guess to the extent that one can talk about silver linings of the last few months, I think, as Rose said at the outset, this is a moment in which people very well understand the value of being in the club or being out of the club. And, the membership in NATO is what is preserving the independence and sovereignty of a number of NATO states right now. And you can bet that the ones on the eastern flank know that and know it well. I think I wouldn't be surprised to see in the coming months that this eventuality provides an opportunity for governments that have had mixed records or that have had thorny relationships to take some steps of their own towards healing their relationship with other NATO allies and with NATO principles, because I think they will have domestic support for investing in the relationship with NATO, one that they have neglected, including through anti-democratic steps in recent years. So I don't think that it's held NATO back. And I think actually the value of NATO in this moment might remind folks of what's at stake in their pettier departures from NATO principles.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dan. Anyone else want to add anything to that particular issue? Otherwise, we can move on a little bit. I wanted to ask Dan Fried to assess the risks to Putin realistically in taking this tack instead of the off-ramps that were available to him up until this point. There's been some debate. Some people think, have been saying that this is going to land Putin in a quagmire because of an insurgency that would inevitably arise within Ukraine that would bog him down for years if he continues to pursue this direction. But there's also some thinking out there that people were saying that when Putin went into Syria, and that turned out not to be the case. Dan Fried, what do you think?
I think the risks are considerable. Syria was a conflict far from the Russian heartland. It was limited. He was reasonably successful. Ukraine is close. Russians have relatives in Ukraine. They have feelings about Ukraine. His own security apparatus didn't seem enthusiastic about going in. I mean, that scene of Putin berating Naryshkin, his own head of foreign intelligence service, the SVR, for suggesting that the Russia give diplomacy more time. Putin mocks him on television, in public. That's deep Stalinism. Like, that's what Stalin used to do. He just didn't do it on live TV. That's a big risk. Now, Putin goes in, Ukrainian army falls apart. He manages to seize Ukraine, topple the government, and pull out, then he can claim a victory. But this is war. Things can go wrong in war. Things usually do. I was in the Bush administration for 8 years. It's not clear to me that the Russian people are as bloodthirsty as he would make out. Also, myths of Russian history. The Russian people always rally around the motherland in times of war. Yes, with respect to World War II, they were even willing to fight for Stalin for that. And if you believe Lev Tolstoy, War of 1812 with France, Napoleon, right? But Crimean War, Russia lost. Russo-Japanese War, Russia lost. Revolution. World War I, Germany beat them. The United States saved them. You're welcome. And the Russian Revolution. I'm not suggesting the parallels. I am suggesting that the myth of eternal Russian willingness to rally around the flag and endure sacrifices is true when the motherland is in danger, not so much for an aggressive war. Now, maybe Putin's right. He's calculated the mood. He's got a propaganda apparatus. Some people will believe anything. I get that. But it's a big roll of the dice, especially if the Ukrainians make a fight of it, as I think they are likely to do. We need to make sure that this becomes a strategic catastrophe for Putinism. I hate being in this position. I have friends in Kyiv, and many of you do too, and friends in Lviv. But this is where we are. And Putin is rolling the dice. I don't know how it ends.
Again, if I could just add a quick comment to what Dan had to
Please.
say. I was thinking about the the assistance that Putin has given to Bashar al-Assad in Syria in his civil war over the last years, where they have succeeded essentially in flattening the country in many ways, a very violent conflict. And I was thinking that that level of violence, if the full force of the Russian armed forces are thrown against Ukraine, that is going to create shocks among the Russian population. Again, going back to the point Dan made about there being so many ties of blood, culture, family, history between Russia and Ukraine. If the level of violence gets anywhere near what we've seen in Syria in recent years at the hands of the Russian armed forces, then I think that will have an effect, a strong reverberation back in Russia. I don't know what that means. You know, people say, no, there's no popular resistance to Putin. There won't be, you know, everybody will just roll over. I don't know, but I do know that people are watching with, you know, just the American word gobsmacked, I guess that's an old English word. People don't know what to make of this as I'm reading the media today. And by the way, I'm concerned. There's a lot now we're seeing on Twitter and the social media and so forth that's telling us about the mood of the people, but I won't be surprised to see all that shut down in short order, and the Russian propaganda machine basically taking over, pumping out the not only national messages to the domestic audience, but also international messages. So we'll have to see what we can do to maintain contact in this period.
Can I also jump in?
Yes, please.
I want to pick up something that Dan said very early on, and Rosa's comments, but he said that sanctions don't always work as quickly as you'd want them to. In the near term, I think Putin's actually in a pretty okay position from his standpoint, because the devaluation of the ruble is how, you know, he pays people's salaries in rubles, and he subsidizes the large majority of the Russian population with targeted subsidies when he wants to buy their satisfaction with rubles, and he's still going to be exporting gas and getting paid in hard currency. And so even though he is sinking the ship, he actually is getting, I do think this is a strategic error, and I think Russia was not in a strategically strong position even before the strategic error, but this compounds it. I think in the near term, it is entirely possible that he will be able to mollify enough of the Russian people that we won't see massive resistance to this until they start to feel the consequences. But he can forestall that with reserves spending and the fact that the devaluation actually helps him. The people who are really hurt by it are actually the corrupt oligarchs around him who have benefited from it for many years. And I think turning up the pressure on them right now is really important. Although to the points previously made, you know, the farce that we saw in terms of the national security meeting, and, you know, people reversing, Lavrov kind of charging off towards diplomacy and then reversing his position mid-speech to come back to the other direction. It really underscores the fact that when Putin wants Lavrov's opinion, he gives it to him. You know, I don't think Putin is under immediate domestic pressure, but I think over time we could see that evolve.
Thank you very much, Dan. And there was also that very strange scene when Putin was meeting with his National Security Council, him sort of humiliating one of his top officials there in a particular exchange, which was very, very interesting to see. And I've wondered about what might be some fallout from that. Rosa, I want to go back to you for a minute and talk about this Budapest memorandum that a lot of people have heard a lot about in relation to this conflict, of course. In 1994, just a few years after the breakup of the former Soviet Union, Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons it inherited in exchange for security guarantees from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Russia abrogated that agreement, as it's the Budapest Memorandum, as it's known, when it invaded Crimea and Eastern Ukraine in 2014. So this is kind of a two-part question. Someone in our audience asks, did the failure to enforce the Budapest Agreement in 2014 weaken the US and NATO's position in the current crisis? And the second is, this declaration of war that Putin issued yesterday, and the statement that he made in there, quote, "To anyone who would consider interfering from the outside, if you do, you will face consequences greater than any you have faced in history. All relevant decisions have been taken. I hope you hear me," unquote. Is Putin threatening the use of nuclear weapons in the event of, quote, outside interference? What do you make of that?
Well, there's a lot there to unpack, Viola. Let me just say a couple of things first about the Budapest Memorandum. I was one of the people involved in negotiating the Budapest Memorandum, and it was a hard, very difficult negotiation, not only on behalf of Ukraine. Ukraine was very tough, but Kazakhstan and Belarus both had nuclear weapons on their territory as well at the breakup of the Soviet Union. So all three countries, plus Russia, the United States, and the UK were involved. So the main point is that we were resolved, we, the United States, were resolved that the breakup of the Soviet nuclear arsenal should not result in the creation of 3 new nuclear weapon states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty system. And I was part of the team that made the argument, and again, it was the toughest argument with Ukraine, that their place in the global community was going, and the health of their relationship with the global community was not going to depend on them somehow turning what were Soviet nuclear weapons tied back to a command and control system in Moscow. You know, the Ukrainians would have had to somehow guillotine that command and control system and build up their own command and control system centered in Kyiv, I guess. And there was some talk of that at the time, but it was not a simple matter or a straightforward matter. But the argument we made is that they needed to focus their attention on state building and economy building, and that having nuclear weapons and trying to retain them would in fact be a destabilizing factor. And I will say that the success of the Budapest Memorandum, as I see it, is that from 1994 to 2014, essentially Ukraine had the peace and stability to build up its country as an independent and sovereign state, and to begin to develop more of a healthy national economy with the help of a lot of countries, including the United States of America. So I don't think they would have had those years of stability and kind of a stable environment in which to grow and develop as an independent country if they had insisted on trying to become a nuclear weapon state. They would have not had the help that they had, and they would have faced a lot of pressure from Russia much earlier than they did. The Ukrainian-Russian relationship was pretty healthy up until Putin got it in his mind that he needed to seize Crimea and destabilize the Donbass in 2014. So I do want to just recount that history. I'm convinced to this day that it was the right move at the time. But in response to the person in your audience who asked the question, I do not think that we made enough of the Budapest Memorandum in 2014. And I was in the Obama administration at the time. I did not, I think, push hard enough that we take our responsibilities. They're not security guarantees as under the Washington Treaty among NATO allies that we are bound to come to Ukraine's defense, but we did assure them that we would be ready to do everything we can should their territorial integrity be breached, to work at the negotiating table in consultations and to try to put things right. And my view is we did not make enough of that assurance in 2014. And I count myself, frankly, partly to blame for not being more insistent that we try at that time to take account of those responsibilities. Now, the saber rattling that's going on, I'm not sure, Viola. Putin is doing a lot of things that are very unpredictable. The taboo against the use of nuclear weapons has been extraordinarily strong since the end of World War II and the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So surely he remembers those horrors, and surely he does not think that an existential threat of that kind, because he knows there would be a response from the United States, should be articulated. So I think that's part of the reason why his words were cloaked in mystery to a certain extent. He has done some nuclear saber rattling in the past. So I do take account of the fact that now his words are cloaked in mystery. I'll just say that again. It sounds like a spy novel, doesn't it? But honestly, I do think that at this moment, we have to be ready for anything. And so I know that the president and his military leaders will have that very much in mind, the need to be alert and ready for everything.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Rose. Tess, I want to turn back to you for a minute to talk about the institutional capacity of the United States, especially to respond. It's very well known that the State Department and the NSC were in dire straits under the Trump administration. How much do you see that the Biden administration has been able to reconstitute in this fairly short time, only the first year of the administration, those institutions and be prepared for a major conflict like this?
Yeah, I think it is certainly the case that those institutions were put under tremendous stress, to put it mildly, in the Trump administration. But I see only incredibly seasoned professionals and very competent leaders in these institutions right now. I think it's also the case that nothing rallies the troops, so to speak, like a crisis as big as this one. We have actually confirmed leaders in many of the most important key positions, but I think it's also important to remember that the civil servants who've been in acting positions in the number 2 slots, number 3 slots for sometimes many years now are incredibly competent, and crisis management is actually something they excel at because they know the levers of the bureaucracy, how to talk to each other. So there may still be some fissures and cracks that are being worked out because so many people are coming in new in the leadership ranks over the last year. But I think, we've seen the ability of the Biden administration to really work as a well-oiled machine. When you think about the way that they've coordinated, the transatlantic unity on these sanctions rollouts, when you've seen their ability, for example, with the intelligence community's incredibly impressive, exposure of Putin's plans and intentions and, pretextual plans for, sowing confusion around what became clear was just a naked invasion. That took tremendous coordination. I think folks might not appreciate how hard that is. And, the balancing of the equities between ensuring that enough of the information gets out to create a coherent picture while not exposing sources and methods. That takes tremendous cooperation within the intelligence community and between the IC and policymakers. And you've also seen, as will unfortunately continue to be the case, I think a pretty strong communication. And that's something that we obviously saw none of during the Trump administration. You didn't even have a functioning, press briefing schedule towards the end of the Trump administration that would have been unheard of to see the kinds of conversations that the press are having with senior administration officials now. So I think, despite those fissures and cracks, it actually shows the resilience of these institutions and the ability of the Biden administration to really rally at this very important time. Would we be in a better position? Would we have been in a better position had those institutions not been so attacked? Sure. But we have incredibly strong and competent leaders in place. And as far as I can tell, they're doing everything that they should be doing.
Thank you very much for that. Really good to get that overview because these institutions will be challenged tremendously in the coming months and years, unfortunately. I want to turn back to sanctions and explore that issue a little bit more. And we also have another question that's come in related to that as well. So the Biden administration has had to roll out sanctions very quickly in the last couple of days. That of course they have been preparing them for 4 months, for several months. I mean, what do you see as next on that front? Dan talked about that some at the outset today. How can the administration sort of calibrate and sequence sanctions? And the question we have from Shemin Keitner that came in, she said, "Thank you all very much for being here. Why do we think Putin will respond to crippling the Russian economy if he doesn't care about spilling the blood of Russian soldiers? Aren't the targeted sanctions against personal assets of cronies likely to be more painful? I've seen," she says, "very little rhetoric distinguishing between the Russian regime and the Russian people, except perhaps Zelensky's own direct outreach." So I'd like to invite any of you to sort of weigh in on that, on those issues, that question. Dan
Well-
Fried, do you want to start us off?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a serious question. But sanctions have two purposes. We usually focus on the purpose of changing behavior. That is, sanctions to change the potential aggressor's mind. Sanctions to get around to the negotiating table on the JCPOA, the threat of sanctions to get Putin not to invade. Okay, I get it. But sanctions have another purpose, and that's to punish. Not punish for the sake of providing us with the emotional satisfaction, but punish to hurt the Russian economy, to deprive Putin of those resources. You don't get to make money working with our system when you are attacking our system, buddy. That's kind of the undiplomatic way of putting it. The purpose is to hurt the Russian economy and to deprive Putin of the resources he needs for further aggression, and to show the Russian people that there are consequences. Yeah, somebody's going to say, what about the innocent Russian people? Why should they be hurt? Well, the answer to them is Putin put you in this position. Russia is making war on its neighbor for no good reason. What did you expect? Now, when you get into this kind of economic pressure scenario, it almost never works out just according to your plan. But it can work out if you're patient and if you mean it. Now, where's the Soviet Union today? I remember the Soviets and the Polish communist regime during martial law laughed at our sanctions, snickered. They were snarky about it. In the end, didn't work out so well. I'm not predicting a repeat. I'm just saying that history moves in interesting ways. We have to mean it. And I don't know where we end up, but I suspect we're going to go into a prolonged period of general economic pressure against the Russian economy. By the way, apparently the British sanctions are out, and they include full blocking sanctions against major Russian state banks. That suggests the US sanctions that are going to be announced this afternoon will be similar, and I hope so. That's a big deal. That's a hit.
Great. Thank you very much. Anybody else want to weigh in on the sanctions question? Then perhaps I can go to Tess Bridgman. Tess, can you, when we're talking about sanctions as one approach, can you tell us a little bit more about US law and what US law says about the situation that the United States is in trying to deal with Russia in this particular conflict? And what do you think is perhaps the most powerful tool that the Biden administration has right now?
I think Dan Fried actually laid some of them out. There are export controls and authorities that are pretty technical and in the weeds, but the upshot is try to make it difficult for Russia to run its economy, to run its military, deprive it of the types of goods and services that it might need to maintain its what could become a full-scale occupation of Ukraine. There are plenty of things, and you've heard about some of them today, and we'll see some of them, I'm sure, rolled out in the near future that could be done under U.S. law. I think the important thing, as has been mentioned already, is that we try to have both transatlantic but also broader multilateral international unity on some of those measures to make sure that Russia can't just simply engage in workarounds on some of those things. There has been a lot of concern as well around, what kinds of measures can we take that would actually have, and I think Shemaine Keitner's question is a good one here, have the most impact. That's something that folks inside the administration, going back to your last question, Viola, have been, I'm sure, looking at very, very closely for weeks and months now. So I expect that we'll see that there is, a strategy to that is very well coordinated in advance with the legal teams who are vetting each of these, sanctions, export controls, other economic levers. Just sort of one legal note that might be of interest to some is that there is actually an obligation not to render assistance to or aid a state that is engaging in sort of the most egregious forms of breaches of the UN Charter. Essentially, it's an obligation of not assisting those who are in serious breach of their international obligations in a way that is a gross or systematic failure to abide by their obligations. Russia is clearly engaged in that. And one way that legal obligation to not render assistance or aid in maintaining that unlawful situation has been interpreted is, in fact, not rendering economic assistance and not cooperating economically with the state who's engaged in that kind of conduct. So that's something that I think states should be able to take comfort as well, that there is, in fact, a legal obligation not to render aid or assistance in maintaining the unlawful situation that Russia has created.
Can I ask Tess a question? What do you think about? I think China matters in this context much more in this conversation than in the traditional way that it gets brought into the conversation about Russia and Ukraine. And I think there's been some overstatement of, I think people need to remember that China and Russia together make up about 1/6 of the global economy. The group of countries that have so far delivered sanctions in response to Russia's actions, I think, make up probably close to 3/4 of the global economy. So they're not like for like, but I wonder whether the international community should be putting more pressure on China with reference to its international obligations and Russia's violations of its own to not give aid and comfort to the Russians in the coming weeks and months, to not give economic assistance that would compensate for the sanctions that are being delivered, because that would be a violation of China's obligations under the under the UN Charter as well.
Yes, I agree.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Appreciate it. I want to turn very quickly we have about 10 minutes left, and we have had some good questions, some of which have already been answered and are incorporated in some of my questions. Tess, I want to stick with you for a minute to ask you, what are we seeing already and likely to see with respect to new cyber and hybrid tactics in this crisis? And are NATO and its individual members prepared, in your view, for this aspect of the conflict? And perhaps also addressing what Russian actions would or would not trigger NATO's Article 5 commitments for mutual self-defense.
It's a great question. I might take that last part and then actually leave to some of my co-panelists the question of NATO member preparation, which I think they may have more insight into than I do. There's been a lot of talk about, potential invocation of Article 5 of NATO, and I think most of our viewers will be aware that that is the provision that essentially calls for collective self-defense in the event of an armed attack. The likelihood of that arising in the cyber context, I actually think, is somewhat low. I think it's more likely to arise in the context of, a shooting skirmish, in the periphery of Ukraine, bordering on NATO member states. NATO has repeatedly confirmed that there is, that the right of self-defense does apply in cyberspace. But I think it's important to recognize that the rest of the rules of international law apply in cyberspace as well. So in order for a use of force to give rise to the right of self-defense and response, it has to rise to the level of an armed attack. That means it's one of the most grave forms of a use of force by its scale and its effects. The likelihood of Russia launching that type of attack against a NATO member state, or even seeing spillover, I think, from an attack within Ukraine that causes those kinds of effects within a NATO member state, I think and I hope is fairly low. So you're going to see responses that are what we often hear referred to as below the threshold, right? Not responses that are use of force, pursuant to our right of self-defense to an armed attack, but rather, countermeasures for violations of sovereignty, for violations of the obligation of non-interference. Those are the kinds, and countermeasures are otherwise unlawful actions below that do not include the use of force, that become lawful in response, essentially, to the unlawful actions of the attacking party. Here it would be, a Russian cyber operation, for example, that causes significant damage, but doesn't rise to the level of physical damage or death on a level that constitutes an armed attack, could still very well violate the sovereignty of the states experiencing those effects. So a state could resort to countermeasures in response, could take actions in the cyber domain or not in the cyber domain in that context, but we'll want to avoid spirals of escalation. So I think it's also important to note that before we think about what kinds of responses to take for those kinds of below the threshold of armed attack, or even below the threshold of use of force cyber operations, what kind of escalatory spiral might those create? Are we better off focusing in the first instance on hardening our defenses, on being more resilient, and then thinking through what coordinated countermeasures might be taken in response to those kinds of actions? So I'll stop there and turn to whether any of my co-panelists want to talk about NATO member preparation.
Well, I'll just say once again that NATO has had a lot of practice in recent years in terms of both cyber attacks, dating back really to the major cyber attack on the Estonian government and banking system in 2007. Since that time, Estonia has frankly led the way in driving action in the alliance to be able to deal with cyber attacks. NATO has a good deal of resilience and is very, I would say, practiced now. Again, as I was talking about air policing a while ago, daily NATO headquarters and individual NATO member states suffer multiple cyber attacks. So there's a lot of practice in dealing with that. And a lot of efforts to build up resilience overall and to keep on top of the threats, because the threats are constantly evolving and becoming more and more complex. So NATO's been doing a lot of work in that regard. Is it perfect? No, by no means. They cannot, successfully defeat every attack, but they've been doing a lot to try to be ready and resilient in that case. Same with misinformation. And I have to say that having had the battle groups in the Baltic states and Poland since 2016 has done a lot, I think, to build up tactical resilience in terms of misinformation, because the Russians were constantly, for example, they'd get the mobile phone numbers of these young soldiers serving in these units and try to demoralize them by saying, we know where your girlfriend lives, we know where your wife and children are, so there was a lot of really down and dirty stuff going on. But again, NATO has worked hard in this period to build up resilience, to be able to counter the misinformation quickly, certainly to keep the morale level up among soldiers and deal with that, but also in terms to be able to respond at a higher level. So the work that I think NATO's pretty sophisticated in that regard. Again, Russia's damn good. So, and constantly evolving its own tactics. But nevertheless, I do think NATO has had a good deal of preparation for addressing those hybrid aspects.
And the Biden administration has also, just to two-finger here, the Biden administration, if you're talking about institution building, one of the things they did when they created the National Security Council that we have now was to create a new Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Tech, and Neuberger, who they sent to Europe 2 or 3 weeks ago, recognizing that a cyber response from Russia was likely to accompany any attack on Ukraine that would invite Western response. And so there has been a near-term effort to kind of build up the resilience of partners, including the Ukrainians in Europe as much as possible, understanding that that would be part of the game right now.
Great. Thank you very much for that, all of you. We only have a few minutes left, unfortunately, and I do want to give an opportunity for all of our panelists to sort of make any sort of concluding remarks, points that you think are particularly important for all of us, issues for all of us to watch out for in the coming days, weeks, and months, and any pointers that you might have for directions that could be fruitful in terms of trying to confront this unprecedented conflict. Shall I start with Rose, perhaps, if you could give us your final thoughts on this would be.
All right, well, let me return to the point that I made in the outset. And as I said, I stole it from a Russian commentator this morning saying that Russia has abandoned its strategic role, its strategic objectives in the world on behalf of this idée fixe of Putin to grab Ukraine. In that context, I am trying to think about, what do we do to replace Russia in the positive roles it has been playing? It is so ironic, the Iran nuclear deal. The foreign minister in Tehran just came out this week and said, great progress is being made. We may, although there are difficulties, we may actually get the restoration of the JCPOA. Unbelievably, Russia has been playing a really positive role in those negotiations and has helped to really push that ball along. So what do we do when Russia becomes absent at the table of the nuclear nonproliferation regime, for example? I'm not quite sure at this juncture, but I do think that there are some profound implications for the big international regimes where Russia has tended to play a productive role over the years. And we need to think through how are they going to play now? Are they going to become uncooperative across the board and not willing to help to advance goals, for example, in the nuclear nonproliferation realm? Or are they going to kind of try to continue somehow with what has been, I think, a significant diplomatic contribution over the years? I cannot say right now. And part of it is going to come, of course, I think, from the reaction of Putin himself to all the countermeasures and the sanctions and everything else that will be thrown at Russia now and must be thrown at Russia now. So we will have to see. Someone in the Q&A asked what's going to be the effect on the nuclear nonproliferation regime overall. It could be a very negative effect, but let us see and think what we can do perhaps to steer the process.
Thank you very much, Rose, for that. Daniel Baer, would you like to make any final remarks?
Yeah, I want to make two related points. One is that foreign policy kibitzers like us, there seems to often be in the background an implicit assumption that there is some kind of perfect policy that if it were perfectly executed would solve the problem. And that's not true. And I think what we've been watching over the last few months has been a really difficult situation where there was no easy policy solution. And I think that is, I think that has to be remembered as the Biden administration has tried to navigate this. I give them very high marks for the way that they have navigated it. And this was a lose-lose situation. The question was trying to figure out the policy that would have the lowest losses. The second point I want to make is about where we are now. We've been kind of playing geopolitics for the last month, and I think where we are now is quite different. And one of the things we need to shift our focus to is to human beings on the ground. There's likely to be a large number of IDPs and refugees who need an immediate assistance. The international community is going to have to help people in neighboring regions. And so I think we should shift our focus to the human questions now.
Thank you. Tess Bridgman, final thoughts.
Thanks, Viola. I was going to emphasize something that Dan Baer just said, which is that we've been talking a lot about the kinds of accountability and responses, that take place on the international institutions plane that, will require unity, will require patience, will require sacrifice on our part with, reciprocal economic costs sometimes. but that these humanitarian response issues actually should be forefront in our mind right now, even potentially ahead of those. In addition to refugee flows, IDPs, as Dan Baer mentioned, we could see really horrible scenes of cities under siege. We can see people cut off from critical infrastructure that they need for basic survival. Things not too dissimilar, unfortunately, from what we've been seeing in Syria for so long. We know all too well the difficulty of trying to provide the kind of humanitarian assistance that's needed for basic survival in these dangerous war zones, where you have an incredibly hostile actor who would see any attempt to provide humanitarian assistance as interference, to quote Viola, what the horrifying statement that Putin made, threatening costs and responses for foreign interference. So that's going to be, I think, the big question that we all need to be focused on right now: is how do we get the humanitarian response started, and how do we effectuate it in a way that isn't going to lead to a spiral in this conflict that brings in more parties. It may not be possible to do both things, but that's something that we need to pay urgent attention to.
Thank you very much, Tess. Dan Fried, final word.
We don't know how the military campaign ends. With prolonged resistance, with the Russians installing a puppet regime in Kyiv, there are a lot of unknowns. We do know that there is unhappiness in Moscow and St. Petersburg, reports of sizable demonstrations. The British have come out with strong financial sanctions. I expect the US to do the same. Dan Baer is right. There is going to be a bunch of Washington people arguing with each other about what we should have done to prevent this. We should have been harder, we should have been softer. I'm really not interested in scoring points. The Biden administration did its best. The fault is Putin's. He started the war. The Biden administration was a lot more engaged than we were in 2008 in the run-up to the Russo-Georgian War, and we were a lot more ready than we were in the run-up to the first Russo-Ukraine War, the one that didn't end. It's on Putin. Let's call him. This is a 20th century tyrant. His playbook resembles, down to the sense of nationalism and hysterical grievance, it's a little bit from Stalin, it's a little bit from Hitler. And I don't use that kind of language lightly. That's where we are. We need to act accordingly. And the Biden administration, I think President Biden himself understands this. So does Tony Blinken in their gut. So does Toria Newland and Wendy Sherman. These are people for whom the lessons of the 20th century and World War II are not abstractions. They don't read talking points, they feel it. And these are people that most of us have known for many years. It's real. And they're absolutely right. Ukraine is not an abstraction or some place in a board game of Risk, which is, if you listen to certain professors, exactly where it belongs. This is real. The Biden administration gets it. So do a lot of the old Reaganites in the Republican Party, by the way. And I'm rooting for them, let me tell you. It's an ugly business, and we have to take it seriously. So Viola, thank you for doing this.
Thank you all very much. Daniel Baer, Tess Bridgman, Daniel Fried, Rose Guttemiller. What an amazing conversation on a very historic day. Thank you for lending some clarity amid this very difficult situation. On behalf of the NYU Law Forum series sponsored by Latham & Watkins, the Reese Center on Law and Security, and Just Security, thank you all in the audience very much for your terrific questions and for your attention to this today. Thank you Goodbye.